Implementing ITIL, Learning Module 1, Getting Started. Welcome to the course, Implementing ITIL. This course already assumes that you know basic ITIL concepts. We will not spend time discussing the processes or how they work or what's inside that, but we'll focus this course on actual implementation efforts and an approach for implementing these processes as you go forward. The goal is to provide enough guidance that you feel comfortable moving forward with your own implementation efforts. In addition, along the way, I will drop in some of my own experiences about what has worked, what you might want to avoid along the way. This is Module 1, Getting Started. We will cover the basic concepts around ITIL and the implementation effort, provide the big picture of how everything fits together in terms of the implementation approach you will use, and at the end of this, you should at least feel comfortable with the general and overall approach that we'll be using. So let's get right into it. Here is the overall approach. We will discuss each of these key steps throughout the course. Our approach uses a classic transformation approach that has been around for decades with many companies that are doing change. But we've customized this specifically for ITIL version 3. Note how this works. We start out with what we'll call the IT Service Management Visioning step. In this step, we'll be looking at why we're doing the ITIL implementation, what are the key business objectives, goals, and strategies for moving forward. Then we will move to the IT Service Management Assessment step. In the assessment step, we will assess our current state processes, technologies, organization, governance and reporting practices, and we will look to see what gaps exist between those elements and the vision that we set in the first step. We then move on to IT Service Management Planning. In this step, we will have translated our assessment output into actionable items and goals and efforts and tasks and something called initial wins. In the planning step, we are putting our project together, assembling our project team and resources, and putting the right project infrastructure in place to move forward. At this point, we will also execute on something called our IT Service Management Initial Wins. These are basically short-term, real-life types of solutions that can be put into place that people can see and touch. They differ from just putting a process in place, as a process tends to be a little bit more strategic. When you put a process in place, it is really more of a capability. With an initial win, we are actually putting something on the table for the business that they can see and touch, that they will see some value in. You will see as we go through this effort that you really need to focus in both directions. Tactical in terms of an initial win, and strategic in terms of the process solutions that you'll be putting into place. The IT Service Management Design stage is about designing our processes. Here we'll basically put our designs together for the process solutions that we plan to put into place. And then following that, our IT Service Management Transition stage will take place, and in that stage, we will essentially take our designs and make them real by transferring them into a production state such that the business and our stakeholders will actually be using these solutions when they go forward. Note that this entire approach then circles back to the visioning stage. The reason for this is that when you implement ITIL, it is not just a one-time project, it is really an ongoing program, and that's the purpose for this. So once we've implemented a certain number of improvements and initial wins, we'll circle back and then pick a next set of initial wins and improvements that we want to implement, and so on and so on. Note that underneath these boxes, we have something called what is the vision, where are we now, how will we get there, let's get to our vision, where do we want to be. This basically is the ITIL lifecycle model taken from the Continual Service Improvement book. Here we've just kind of staged these out because you'll see that the actual approach we're using aligns very well to those same steps. Above the boxes, you see something that is Six Sigma-like, the term DMAIC, which you may not be familiar with, but design, measure, assess, implement, and control. We've just simply put this there so that if there is a Six Sigma initiative within your company, you can see that this approach also fits quite easily into that same kind of a strategy. One last thought on our approach is that when you run through all these steps of the implementation life cycle here, try to keep this within a 9-month period if at all possible. Don't try to plan this out to extend over multiple years. Typically those kinds of projects are fraught with risk, and then people keep coming back asking, what is the goal of this? Why do we still continue to do this? Box these into 9-month segments such that every 9 months or so you're running through this cycle: visioning, assessment, planning, design, initial wins, and transition. So here's our agenda for learning module number 1. Each module, as we present this, will have a series of lessons. In learning module 1, here are our 4 lessons that we'll cover. In lesson 1, we'll take a very high-level look at the approach again, how our implementation life cycle works, and what those steps and key activities typically are. In lesson 2, we'll cover some basics around what is an IT service. The reason for doing this is that one of the challenges you will have in your implementation effort is that the confusion around what are the services that your organization delivers, how do you describe them, and how do you package them so that the business actually can gain value from them is a typical challenge most IT organizations face. And without a basic understanding of what a service is, it gets very hard to implement anything within ITIL. In lesson 3, we'll talk about some basic ITIL concepts that in general confuse IT, and we'll present a recommended operational model that you can use to help lay out what the differences are between things that like a service, a request, a change, a project, and so forth. And then lastly, in lesson 4, we'll talk a little bit about how you organize for your implementation effort to make it succeed. Lesson 1, overview of our implementation approach. In this lesson, we'll take a very high-level look at each of the steps within our implementation lifecycle approach. Let's start by talking about what things are really working for others that have already been undergoing ITIL implementation efforts. Number 1. Ultimately, this is an organizational change effort, not an IT software project. This will require a bit of a change in your thinking as you go forward. Organizational change is about changing people and behaviors to act and organize and operate in a manner differently from how they're operating today. That is a huge effort to undertake, and what you will find is that over 80% of your efforts will be spent particularly in this area. With an IT software project, we're very much used to implementing software, testing it, installing it, and then when it appears to be working and running, calling it finished. With ITIL and with an organization change effort, it doesn't work in the same manner, because you are working with people, not with hardware and software more than anything else. While you might be implementing hardware and software as part of your ITIL solutions, you will find that it is the people part that will create the most challenge. So always remember that this is truly an organizational change effort more than anything else. Item 2, balance strategic with tactical efforts. This means that you'll be looking at the long-term big picture while at the same time delivering some short-term wins and value. Our implementation lifecycle approach has been set up to do this for you. That is where you will see things like initial wins, which are your tactical efforts and show value right away, and your process design and transition, which is basically more of the strategy in terms of putting the capabilities into place so that you continually improve IT along the way. In step 3, or number 3 here, again, very important to focus on the fact that we want to solve a business problem first, not put in processes and tools. So implementing ITIL is really not the goal. It is really just the way to get to the goal. And that is something to always keep in mind. If you find that people are treating your idle project as, for example, we are going to implement a CMDB or an incident management tool or the change management process, there's a good likelihood that you're going to see a lot of risks and potentially fail. Because at the end of the day, the business doesn't really care about those items. They want to see some value and see some real things that people can see and touch that are solved. Again, those items might be part of your effort and they're a means to achieve some goals, but you need to make sure your effort focuses on a specific business outcome. And again, as we go through the learning modules, we'll be giving you some hints and help, especially in Learning Module 2 for this. For number 4, target 20% of the effort that gets you 80% of the results. If you have absolutely no change management capability in-house, for example, put in the most important pieces first and get some value from them before you design the rest and build the rest of the process. So for example, with your change management solution, if you had absolutely nothing, probably simply logging and reporting on changes will provide a tremendous amount of benefit right off the bat. Whether you actually implement a CAB and you have a better job that you do of analysis and maybe doing impact analysis, those things are certainly important for a very good change management process. But again, those might be longer term benefits that you might see down the road if you haven't anything at all to start with. So the idea here is identify the 20% of the effort that gets you 80% of the results first and focus on that. Because remember, this is a program, not a project. Therefore, the things that you may not implement the first time around, you can try to pick up on the next round. Number 5, balance leadership with management. Leadership is about setting vision, inspiring people, and moving people in a certain direction. Management is about making sure that things get done, that processes are implemented, that solutions are put on the table. You need to have both of these, and as you put your leadership and your management teams together, recognize that both of these need to be done. Number 6, establish compelling business reasons for why you're undergoing this implementation effort. This will be greatly helped by focusing on the business problems that you're really trying to solve. But again, those problems need to be compelling. There needs to be a reason why people will spend time and effort in implementing IDLE. Number 7, scope your effort on the services delivered, not the location or business unit. What I mean by this is that if you are in the process of implementing an IDLE process, recognize that your rollout effort for that, your deployment effort for that, needs to consider the entire organization. I've been in a number of places where people will say, well, we're going to implement IDLE processes, but we're only going to do it for this data center or that data center, or maybe this business unit or that business unit. The reality is that many times the services that the business actually sees are coming from all your business units or all your data center locations. And so if you simply implement IDLE in one of those, while you might improve somewhat the operation in that one center, the overall impact of that and the benefits of that may not be seen by the business. And then they will circle back and ask, why did you spend so much time implementing? We didn't see much for that effort. So be very careful when you scope your efforts to make sure you continually look at where the benefit and the value is going to be. Number 8, senior management must provide funding and walk the talk. So it's more than just having senior management fund a project. They have to be visible. They have to be seen. Your staff has to see that your senior management is committed to this effort and that they're very visible in making rewards for people as they move along through the implementation effort. And then lastly, number 9, metrics are absolutely critical. You should start measuring your processes and your solutions starting from day one. Even if you don't have the capabilities in place, put that as a to be determined and then start filling those in as you start to proceed down your implementation effort. That alone will show management that progress is being made and things are moving forward. The focus of the implementation can start at any point in the V3 lifecycle. The continual service improvement covers the assessments and approach as well as metrics. If you only focus on one lifecycle segment, let's say operations, You may miss or not see enough benefits. It's possible that bigger benefits may be hidden within some of the other life cycle areas, possibly even in the overall delivery strategy itself. As an example, we have one company that outsourced its service desk, and in doing so completely broke their incident and request management processes. So the key point and the key learning takeaway from this is that implementation for ITIL can be at any point. Again, the driver for this will be the business problems that you're trying to solve. So here are some examples. We've taken some possible business problems that might exist in a typical IT organization and identified where the possible starting point might be from V3 to address it. So looking at some of these examples, let's say I have too many incidents and very poor operational stability. Where would I look within ITIL? Where would I start to address that issue? For there, the service operations probably would be a good starting point, specifically problem management, because it is the goal of problem management to find root causes, look for trends, and basically eliminate incidents from occurring in the first place. Another area not listed here, but could be a candidate, might be a bit of availability management and service design as well. The second one, can't deal with the high pace of business change. While dealing with changes, we may really want to focus on the service transition types of processes, possibly change management or release management. Let's say we can't articulate our services and our costs. Maybe management wants to know what is it IT truly delivers, or where can IT specifically start to cut costs if necessary. We may start focusing there on service strategy to focus on developing the picture of our services, aligning our costs to that picture, and moving forward. We'll actually see a very good approach for doing that in this learning module later on. If you're not sure where to start, problems are all over the place, but you're really not clear on what to fix first or where to go first, again, the Continuous Service Improvement book may be the first place to go, specifically by looking at some of the measurements and assessments that you can do first to help drive the direction of where you should start implementation. If you need to meet audit or regulatory requirements, you may look at service design to see if the right things are being designed into your solutions to make those happen. If you're operating with high levels of risk, security is bad, availability or reliability, again, the service design might be a starting point, specifically availability management, to help identify a risk plan and the levels of risk and their likelihood, and then what actions to take to address those. And then lastly, another example is if your organization is taking a second look at their sourcing for different IT services, maybe they're looking at IT outsourcing, again, I would be looking at the service strategy area, specifically the service portfolio in that case, to understand what it is we may address. So again, the key goal can't be stated enough. Fix a business problem and then implement the pieces and parts of ITIL that best address that problem. That is the approach we will recommend, and that's the approach we'll be using as you go forward with your implementation. The results of that kind of an approach will be seen by the business, and your efforts will typically be successful as they will see value in that. If you're starting this effort by saying we're going to install a process or we're going to install a tool, be aware that these kinds of approaches rarely meet with success at the end. One other comment to make about this is sometimes you hear this argument about what really comes first. Is it the process or is it the tool? I would argue that it is always the process that comes first. Even the tool vendor, and you could pick any one, let's take an example like change management or incident management. The tool vendor that built the tool to work with those elements basically had to understand what incident management or change management process they were having or thinking about in order to create the design requirements for their tool when they built it. So even there, you're starting with process, even though that vendor is ultimately selling the tool. So here we see our ITIL implementation lifecycle approach: visioning, assessment, planning, design, and transition. And we've overlaid that with the ITIL service lifecycle elements just so you can get a little bit of a bigger picture on where everything is fitting here. When we start with the IT service management visioning, a lot of the activities and guidance really will mirror a lot of what is in the ITIL service strategy area. As we look at assessment, assessment is really part of the continual service improvement area. But the key part of that in terms of taking our initial measurements and doing our assessments. As we get into planning, design, and our initial wins, the service design is really the guidance that would take place for many of those. If we look at the IT service management transition step, a lot of the concepts and guidance and processes that are done in the service transition book would align to that. One of the things you'll see later on, and the ITSM transition is a good example of that, is that we actually will use a little bit of what I call a bootstrap approach. We will actually be using concepts from ITIL release management and deployment to actually execute our ITIL implementation effort. So we're using ITIL to implement ITIL. Really good concept. So let's take a high-level view of our first stage, the visioning work stage. This identifies the business issues to be addressed, the IT service management mission and overall approach. To the left are some key steps in this effort. To the right, we've illustrated some key work products that come out of this effort. We will discuss this work stage much more when we get to our learning module number 2 of our course. But here, a peek at some of the efforts that are involved in this stage include, first of all, managing the work stage. That's just the simple project management piece of that. But then identifying what are the business problems we want to solve. What's that business focus? Drafting an IT service management vision. Drafting a strategy. Building a communication strategy. And the communication strategy will be the vehicle that we address the organizational change piece that is so important that we talked about earlier. We will identify program risks, costs, assemble our vision document, and then get agreement from all our stakeholders in terms of how we laid out the vision and how we intend to move forward and proceed. In the assessment stage, we look at current state, identify gaps, remedial actions to close them, and obtain agreement to move forward on those actions. Note that your assessments can yield lots of actions. By having our vision first, we now have the capability to hone in on those actions that best address the vision and the goals we want to achieve. Some of you may have had the experience with having done an ITIL assessment effort and having whoever did the assessment come out with hundreds of recommendations. How do you prioritize those? How do you know which ones you should really focus on? If you've gone through the visioning stage first, then that becomes quite clear in terms of which ones you truly want to address first. We will go into more depth about assessments when we cover this work stage in learning module number 3. Note that the scope of our assessment includes process, technology, organization, and governance practices. So we're not simply assessing processes, we're taking a look at the entire IT picture when we go through this stage. When you look at the steps that are involved with this part of the effort, notice that they align to those areas. We're going to manage this work stage, focus the assessment in terms of what areas we truly want to look at, and then we're going to assess our processes, our technologies, our organization and governance practices. We'll then analyze the assessment findings, identify recommendation actions, and then translate these to those short-term initial win efforts, and then again check in with our stakeholders and obtain a go-forward agreement to move forward with what we plan to do. Here's the planning work stage. This is all about setting up the improvement program office, getting plans into place, and being ready to start the effort. We will discuss this work stage much more in detail when we get to learning module number 4. I will be honest with you up at the front and say much of this is pretty much basic project management 101. Establishing a program office, putting program working standards into place, work plans, your teams, communications, and obtaining the final go-ahead decision from your stakeholders to move forward. There's truly no real rocket science with the tasks and activities in this work stage. It is really about setting up your program and moving forward. However, we'll put kind of an ITIL spin on that and discuss this in more detail along ITIL lines when we get to learning module number 4. Initial wins are about getting results quickly by putting tactical solutions into place that provide immediate and recognizable value. In this stage, we implement those specific win actions to demonstrate the results. Note that the steps in this stage follow that release management implementation life cycle that we talked about early on. Some of the key steps with this, as you see, kind of mirror that approach. Besides managing each individual initial win project, we're going to do some initial planning. We're going to design and procure the initial win solution, build and configure that solution, conduct fit-for-purpose testing, perform some initial win acceptance activities, do some rollout planning, communication, preparation, and training, and then distribute and install the initial win solution as we go forward. Again, a lot of this approach looks very familiar to the release and deployment process which exists within ITIL. So here is the design work stage. It is here where the design steps to build your processes, your tools, governance, and organization will take place. This follows the ITIL service design guidance by looking at your solutions holistically. Every solution you put on the table, again, should always be thinking in terms of process, technology, people, and governance. We will discuss this design work stage in much more depth in both Learning Modules 5 and Learning Module number 6. Again here, just a quick view, you can see some of the tasks that exist in this work stage. We're talking about putting together our communication strategy and designing that. Designing our mission and goals, our principles, inputs and outputs, policies, procedures, our tools, roles and skills, organization, and finally building a process guide and putting in process reporting. You'll see a lot of these tasks tend to mirror the ITIL process model, and that was done on purpose because you need all the elements of that process model to be into place before you truly have a successfully running process. So lastly, here's the transition work stage. Again, here we will use the release and deployment concepts to build, test, and transition our solution designs and bring them to a production state. This work stage will be covered in depth when we get to Learning Module number 7. But here you can see some of the activities involved. Managing this work stage, coordinating initial win rollout activities as we move forward, executing on our communication strategy by coordinating communications and training, building our transition strategy, implementing service reporting, our IT service management organization, governance controls, and then lastly, reviewing our accomplishments, identifying what key issues and things that we may want to work on next, and then that will become input as we circle back to that visioning stage at the beginning of our implementation life cycle and figure out what it is we want to work with and focus on in the next round of implementation. So here again is our implementation life cycle, and just a quick recap. Remember that we start with the visioning, identifying our business goals, our reason for the implementation, what business problems we intend to fix, and our mission and scope of what we plan to do going forward. We then move to assessment, which is where we will assess our current state processes, technologies, organization, and governance, and align the gaps of that assessment, the output of that assessment, with the vision and goals that we set in the first stage. We then move on to planning. And in planning, we translate those assessment outputs to initial wins. We start putting our program together, and we start planning for how we intend to move forward. Our initial wins take a project focus to tactical elements that can be implemented quickly to provide immediate value and benefit. At the same time, and in tandem with that, we're undergoing IT service management design and transition. In design, we are strategically looking at the processes that we want to underpin our initial wins and how we will strategically work with our idle solutions as we move forward and putting the right capabilities into place. And then in our transition, we will take those designs and undertake activities to transition those to a production state. When we're done with this implementation, we'll then circle back to visioning again and identify a next set of items to implement as we go through. Remember that this is a program that continually goes on, not just a one-time project. So let's take a brief look at some key factors for success. These are based on some study that the Boston Consulting Group had done a number of years ago to identify common factors for projects that create great success. Here we've tailored these factors a bit for your idle projects. You may want to review these up at the front. Missing any of these should raise a red flag that you may have some challenges that you'll need to overcome in your efforts. Let's take a look at what these are. Number one, senior management has to be committed to make this work. I've yet to see an idle project that successfully worked without any senior management commitment. Number two, you have to have stakeholder commitment. Stakeholders can be anybody in your company that is either sponsoring your idle effort or will be a recipient of using it when it's completed. So the stakeholders need to be on board with this, otherwise success won't be seen. You need to have skilled and available project teams and resources. I guess that really goes without saying. You also need to have very clear benefits and an agreement on the vision and the approach. Again, the visioning stage will help you hone that and fashion that so that it does become clear in terms of what that vision and benefits might be. But those need to be clearly articulated, and everybody needs to agree this is what we're going to get out of this effort. You need to know that the adoption of the solutions should be able to occur without requiring those that will use the new solutions to work more than 10% over and above their day jobs. What this means, and let's just use an example, say incident management. Let's say we're putting a new incident management solution into place. The people that will be using that process already have other jobs within the IT organization. Maybe they're server administrators, network administrators, technical support, other kinds of people doing things. They have a full-time day job in terms of their responsibilities. In order for them to learn and adopt the new incident management process, they're going to have to participate in terms of understanding how that process works. There may be training for them to learn that new process. There may be a new tool that they have to use. That will take some of their time away from what they normally work on a day-to-day basis. Experience has shown, and certainly the Boston Consulting study showed, that if they need more than 10% of their hours spent learning all those new things above their day job, you may encounter a lot of resistance. Interesting point to consider. The last point is that a regular program review of each idle project that you're putting into place should probably take place no more frequently than at least 2 months. So in other words, don't let your project continue to ramble on and nobody's really taken a project review for it, say within the last 3, 4, or 5 months. You should have program reviews at least 2 months in duration, but no longer than that. In your student materials, we've included a modeling tool that comes with the Implementing Idle book, actually the Measuring Idle book. This modeling tool can be used to help you predict your own success right at the front. This takes all the key success factors that we talked about on the previous slide, puts them into a spreadsheet model where you can fill out some simple answers, literally a yes or no to some of the questions that are there, and then get a picture in advance of how successful your project might be. This model is called the DICE model, and there are 4 key components with it. Duration, again, that addresses that time between those project reviews. Integrity, that's the extent to which your organization can rely on the project team to execute. So in other words, I have skilled project resources that people feel confident about. Commitment, ensuring that you have that senior management and stakeholder commitment as you go forward. And effort, which again is the estimated amount of time over and above everyone's day job that they'll need to make to understand the new process or solution you're putting into place. Here's a brief screenshot from the DICE tool that you have. All you do is simply enter the values in the blue areas, and then the tool will calculate your level of risk. If your scores are low, you can model the impact of taking some actions to see how it may boost your score or your chance of success. For example, let's say your score comes out fairly low, and you can use the colors to help guide you in terms of what area to look at. And let's say we see that the low area happens to be maybe on the commitment side. So we can model by pretending what happens if we focus on getting better senior management commitment, plug that estimated value back into the tool, and see if our project will become more successful. The very bottom box, and you can kind of see that on the slide where it says worry zone in yellow, is basically telling you the end state of how your project is looking. The colors will vary from green, meaning it looks like you have a pretty good chance of success with your effort, to red, which means you may have some significant issues you'll need to be worried about and overcome first. So again, this is just an upfront tool you can use to model your chances of success before you even start and identify potential issues that you can address right away to make yourself successful.
Slide 16. Lesson 2. It's all about the IT services. Wanted to spend some time to talk about IT services a bit. Everything IT does is a service. A lot of IT problems occur because IT simply cannot articulate its services and confuses services with a lot of things like delivery organizations, products, processes, requests, and this confusion is really the root of many IT problems. One of the key reasons that version 3 was written was to place an emphasis on service. There was a concern that version 2 took the focus off service and put it too much on process. The processes are important, but at the end of the day, the business wants services. It doesn't really care about the processes or technologies that you are using. So what's a way to get your IT organization started down the path of operating by service, which is really the key goal of putting ITIL in place in the first place? I'm going to take you through a very tactical approach in this lesson that provides a very quick way to start down this path. This approach has been used with a number of organizations. It resonates very well with senior executives and leaderships, and the approach will cover a bit of the visioning and assessment work stages. This could be a starting point in terms of your entire version 3 effort, and out of this you could then jump into that vision and assessment stage with the output of the tactical steps that I'm going to show you here. There are 3 things that every IT organization needs to know, or it's really not managing IT. An organization needs to know what services is it delivering to the business. It needs to know what are the costs for each of those services that are being delivered. For example, if email is a service being delivered to the business, what am I spending to deliver email? And then lastly, it needs to know the demand for that service. What business activities cause that service to get consumed? In the case of email, it might be how many employees I have in my company. You need to understand those 3 elements, services, costs, and demand, or you're not really managing IT. The lack of understanding that leads to a lot of issues that IT tends to fight with today. That is what these 5 steps on the slide are trying to show you and help you get to. A good way to think about this with senior executive leadership is if they were talking to the business and the business were to ask, do you understand the services you're delivering? Most IT organizations would say probably no. They could ask, do you know what you're spending to deliver those services? Again, IT wouldn't know. They would ask, do you know how your services are being used by various people in our business organization? And the answer also would be no. Now imagine if you were on the business side learning that from IT, you can imagine how poorly IT must be running without understanding that. That is the crux of version 3. That is why version 3 was written. And if you pick up the version 3 strategy book, that is what that book is all about. Identifying what are your services, your costs, and your demand. And that is a key difference with version 3 from what version 2 in terms of its focus. So let's take a look at these steps. There are 5 steps to help you get started in a tactful manner down this path. Step 1, building a portfolio of services. This is where you'll identify what your IT services are. Step 2, let's figure out what our current costs are, and let's just gather up that cost information and create a baseline. Step 3 is where the magic happens. Here I'm going to resort my costs by the services that I identified in step 1. Once I'm at that point and I now have information, which by the way is very valuable to your organization right now, you're going to start to see a whole bunch of areas where you can either improve costs, you may have services that are not reliable, you may have services that have issues, you can see where your projects fit in terms of helping advance those services, and that will be the basis where your vision and your assessment step can start. So that will kind of come in on step 4 of this little set of steps here. And then finally in step 5, we're going to identify our service improvement roadmap. So the way you can use this is kind of like a pre-effort, if you will, to your implementation effort. Your first 3 steps in this picture are going to be identifying what your services are and what your costs are. Then steps 4 and 5 are essentially the vision and assessment step that would occur in our regular implementation approach. And that can help you move forward. But understanding your services, cost, and demand provide so much value, I can't state it enough here, but really identifies where things need to improve and where things need to go. Slide 18. Let's take a look at step 1 in a little more detail. Here's where we are going to identify our IT services. So we're going to go through and identify what those services are. A big boost and a help start for you can be the Servicing Idle book, where all the IT services that most organizations provide are listed there, along with fairly detailed service descriptions. A great way to get started. Now your business support services will be unique to your company. So there you may want to jump into your application inventories, get a few developers in the room, and try to dig up a sentence that each application provides to your company in terms of what it contributes. Those sentences will be either new services or features of services. Again, you'll have to sort that out as you go through that. And then finally, create some high-level service descriptions for what each service is all about. Once we have those service descriptions, we can start to group like services together into service lines. These are just like picking up a catalog from a retail store, for example, where you might see all the books are listed in one area, maybe furniture in another. But the same thing will happen with your services. Put those into service lines so they're easy to find. At this point, you've now created a very basic IT service portfolio. Couple things here to consider. Do not extend this effort or make it more complicated by trying to make a service catalog implementation coincide with this. Just get this down on paper. Simply having this in a Word document or a place where it can be easily found and read will create a lot of value in itself. A service catalog implementation can come along later, and what you have here now is you know exactly what you want to put into that service catalog. I will warn you that as you do this particular step, the biggest challenge you will have is that IT will struggle over what is an IT service. Again, the Servicing Idle book can help there. However, IT will get concepts mixed up and call them services. Requests will be called services. Organizational units like your call center or your NOC might be called a service. Again, what a service is something of value provided to a customer where they don't have to assume specific risk. So identifying what these things are may take a little work, and don't be surprised if people start to argue over what some of these should be. But try to come to some quick agreement as you move forward. Again, the goal here is to get down on paper what are all your services so you understand what IT is delivering today. Let's take a look at step 2 now, building the cost baseline. This can occur in parallel while you're trying to pull all your services together. In this step, all you're simply going to do is gather existing budgets, financial documents, leasing, cost pool, chargeback reports, whatever financial information your organization has, and try to get that in one spot. If you're lucky, maybe somebody's already done it, but what I found in many organizations, they're just as messed up as IT, and you may find things are all over the place in different spreadsheets, different tools, and you're going to end up having to gather this stuff together. But once you do gather it together, the big goal here is just to identify what is the baseline of cost information. What does IT spend today as your organization sees it today? Step number 3, this is where we're going to build our IT service model. Essentially, we're going to recast the costs by the services we actually deliver. Now, since some people are a little confused over how you do this, I'm going to give you a couple of very discrete steps you can take using a spreadsheet as an example. So here on this basic spreadsheet, we're simply going to list all our IT service assets, people, hardware, software, everything that's in there, right in the first column. Those will become rows. The columns themselves will be the actual services that I identified in the first step of our effort here. So a manufacturing support service, email, HR support are kind of shown there as examples. All I'm doing here now is I'm simply putting an X where a service asset is used to support a service. Now you may ask, what's the value of doing this, simply putting X's under what services those assets support? Right away, you've got something very valuable in your hands if you've done this. If you remember change management, impact analysis, one of those challenges that people have, you've actually identified a way where you can now look at what services are impacted by what the assets are simply by seeing that there's an X there. So don't discount this small little effort. It's a very good jump start in terms of starting to map your service assets into all the services that you provide as an IT organization. But this is a good way to start this particular effort by just simply identifying where these things are used with an X in each column for each service that they're used in. Slide 21. Now that we've identified where those service assets are used, let's now assign a rough percentage based on how much of that service asset is used to support each service. So in this example, I've simply replaced the X's with percentages. I have a control total column that just makes sure all the percentages add up to 100%. So in this example, the first one, Unix Server SAP API, we can see is 100% dedicated to the manufacturing support service. Oracle, if we go down 2 more, Oracle database licenses, about 2/3 or 66% are for manufacturing support, 20% for email, and 14% for HR support. So I'm simply identifying rough estimates of percentages of use. Again, the key word here is rough. This doesn't have to be 100% accurate, but enough to get a general picture of how these assets are being used on behalf of each service. The next step is I'm now going to convert those percentages to costs. I can pull the cost information out of all the cost information I collected in the previous step 2 when we talked about getting your baseline costs there. It's not unusual that you'll have costs already in place for each of your IT assets, servers, hardware, software. But here I know if I put 100% in a box somewhere and the asset in the case of the first server costs me $140,000, then 100% will equal $140,000. Again, my Oracle database licenses, I've split up that cost by the percentages that I identified in the previous slide. So I get a couple advantages here. Most importantly, if I add up all the costs down any given column, I've now identified how much I'm spending on behalf of each service. Very valuable information to your IT senior management that they haven't seen before. Okay, now that I have my costs, I can create something called service operating statements. These really just put that cost information, moving it from the spreadsheet into a ledger form that typically managers and business people like to look at. So here all I'm simply doing is I have one page or a statement for each service that's out there. So in this example here, manufacturing support, under the cost column I list all those assets and what the costs are that I'm spending. Under the revenue, I might list any recovery optionally. If I'm doing chargeback for that particular service, I might list that revenue on the revenue side, or a contribution to the business if it's creating a product or something that's being sold. But again, here I'm at least now creating an understanding of what we're actually spending by service. Again, a very valuable piece of information for senior executives in terms of what's going on. At this point in our efforts, we've identified what services IT delivers, and we've identified how much IT spends to deliver each of those services. 2 very valuable items. We still need to identify, though, how the business uses and consumes those services. So to do this, we need to identify units of work, demand drivers, that actually consume the services. these are always expressed in terms of units of work that are business related. So number of customers, number of sales, employees, service locations. So in our email example, probably something like number of employees is what drives the use of email service. You can certainly identify more granular things if you want, but this is a good starting point. What I have at the end of this now is if I simply divide the costs by these demand drivers and volumes, I can actually identify IT unit costs. We'll see that on the next slide. Slide 25. So let's take a look at an example here. Here is our email service. We figured out from adding up all those assets that we're spending roughly, in this example, $989,600 for email. We've decided that our demand driver is number of employees. We now go to the business to have them identify for us what is the employee headcount. The business will also be responsible for forecasting headcount to IT. Notice how we've suddenly placed the business in the responsible area to identify what those demand drivers, and not the drivers, but the volumes are, and how they might be forecasted. That is a task that IT simply cannot do. It has to come from the business. And now simply divide that big cost by the volume that I'm being given by the business, and I now have a cost per unit, or in this example, cost per employee of $206.17 for each email service provided. As simple and straightforward as this exercise is, you would be very surprised at how impressed your senior management is suddenly going to be. They are going to start seeing costs in ways that IT has never presented them before. And this is really how the business runs itself. It's something that IT typically doesn't do and hasn't done in the past. But yet, by operating in this manner, the business suddenly starts to see a lot more with IT in terms of where things are going and how costs are actually being used. Now, there's a very important reason why we're going through this entire exercise and identifying our cost, services, and demand. And let's take a look at the next slide to see why that's so. Picture yourself now walking into a meeting of senior executives where you need to get funding for certain IT things. Okay, what is the best conversation to have? With our service approach, we've changed the entire dynamic of the conversation. We can now articulate our cost for service, our unit costs. We can tie that to business drivers. And in this example, if the company decides that they're going to add employees, we now know that we can add more unit cost for the additional employees and ask for that in terms of funds. Okay, typically IT would come in and say we need, in this first example, $312,000 for server upgrades. That the business doesn't understand and tends to be a little suspicious of that. But in the example below, you can see how by presenting this in terms of unit costs and dollars, that it makes more sense to them. In the example below, we've identified a unit IT cost of 39 cents per widget being produced for IT overhead. And so now we know that if the management wants to increase the number of widgets, this is going to add up to a volume of widgets. In this example, we said the volume adds up to $312,000 additional dollars. The point of this is that the business understands this in a heartbeat. They do not understand why a server needs to be upgraded, but they do understand when you're articulating costs per unit, and if those units increase, that obviously more cost needs to be there to support that. This is the core essence of ITIL version 3, and again, why ITIL version 3 was written the way it was. Is it starts to place the conversation in the form of services and costs and demand and value, which is something that the business always understands, not the technologies and the processes. Now we're ready to jump into our vision step of our implementation approach. At this point, all the previous steps we took simply identified services, costs, and unit costs and demand. So here we can now look at that information and start to put a lens on the information that we have. If we put a cost lens on, we might look for things like wasted costs, the costs that are too high or out of line for the type of service being provided. To look at efficiency, do we have redundant processes? Are we labor intensive? Do we have wasted labor being spent somewhere? Maybe frustration with the service, availability, responsiveness, reliability, or maybe the service is simply hard to use. Time, maybe the service takes too long, it wastes staff time, or it creates bottlenecks for the business. Again, we're starting to look at all these different areas to find things to fix. Some other areas here: risk. Maybe there's some security issues around your services, maintainability, serviceability, hard to maintain or service. You may have regulatory issues. Maybe you're not passing an audit, or more controls need to be put in place around a service. You may have a customer satisfaction issues, poor perception of service, poor satisfaction ratings. Maybe you're paying penalties on service levels. Future, you may have a service that works fine now, but you're worried that it may not be able to be sustained in the future. Or generally value. You may have a service that's just not out there providing a lot of value. Again, you can start to see where these things sit by looking at the information that we've generated up to this point. And these are business problems that can be solved, or will feed into the business problems that you want to solve with your actual ITIL implementation effort. Let's move on to Lesson 3. Spend a little bit of time getting the foundation right on just some key operating concepts. You'll find that a lot of times IT gets very confused over what's a service, what's a function, what's a request, how do these all fit together. And the purpose of this section is to give you some basics in these so that you have a very solid foundation for how things are kind of put together, and in fact how IT itself is put together. So what is a service? Service is just simply something of value to a customer. Examples of IT services include things like email, server hosting, application management, could be payroll support, it could be accounting support, manufacturing support, as well on the business side. You'll find that IT people tend to get very mixed up about services. Examples of non-services is they may point to products like the mainframe or the network. They may say that a vendor like Cisco or IBM or HP is a service. Sometimes people will call NOC a service. NOC is typically a network operations center. That again is a organizational unit, but in itself is not really a service. A couple new things on the marketplace: software is service. Software itself is not a service. So again, it's just something that provides value to a customer. Services tend to come in two main types: business services and IT support services. The key differentiator between these is that a business service is basically a service that the business where they actually see and touch an IT service. So they're actually sitting at their terminal and they're interacting with something. That is a business support service from IT. IT support services are just not seen by the business, but they're there because they need to be to help make things work. So typical IT support services like backup restore, job scheduling, database management, security management, network operations, job scheduling, those are all things that need to be there, but the business never sees them. But other things that the business does see and touch would be a business support service. Again, as I've stated before, IT will have a challenge with identifying what a service is. These are typical problems you'll run into. Every application is a service, every platform is a service, processes and functions could be services, organizational units, vendors. Again, these are challenges that IT has. A warning flag will be how many services you end up with. If you've got thousands of services, then chances are you're kind of doing it the wrong way and looking at it by some of these areas. Most organizations, even very large ones, will typically have a total of anywhere from 60 to maybe 120 or 130 services. If you get beyond that number, chances are you're just getting either too granular or you're making mistakes like some of the examples shown on this slide. Identifying our IT support services. This is probably made simple because we have the Servicing ITIL book, which will tell you what all these are. Now again, you can use the descriptions as provided in that book, or you can use that as a jump start to create your own. This little hierarchy just kind of shows in one way that you can categorize all these services. I have design and build services, transition support services, operational services, resource management services, strategy and control services. And again, these are basically service lines, and the Servicing ITIL book will list these service lines, give you a listing of all the services that are in these along with fairly detailed service descriptions. An interesting contention is that probably most IT organizations do all the same exact services, so there's not a lot of need to change there. It's your business support services that will be different depending on the organization you're in. Identifying our IT business services, this is one approach you can use to help do that. Number one, you can get all your application portfolios together and a few key developers that understand what those applications do. Inventory them if that hasn't already been done, and then start at the top of the list, take an application, ask the developers to describe for you what it does or what it contributes to the company in one simple sentence. Then decide based on that, is that a new service, or if it's not, is it a feature of an existing service? A lot of times application pieces and parts are features and functions of a service, not an entire service in themselves. So classify it as one or the other, then go to the next item in the list and keep working your way down the list until you're done. At the end of this, you'll have a good understanding of all the business support services that your organization is probably delivering. The key trick here is to identify when an application might be a part of a service versus a service in itself. Again, you'll have to use general judgment on that. But to give you one example, is we had one company where we went in and we identified, they had given us a list of about 1,400 different applications, and by the time we got done doing this exercise, we identified only 44 services. So again, you can whittle that list down quite a lot, and by not having every application equal a service, reduce the complexity of what you're pulling together. But at the end of this, everybody feels a fairly comfortable view in terms of now how everything kind of starts to fit in terms of the services it's providing from a business perspective. Little bit on what is a service feature. Feature is basically an element of a service that can be provided to an end user. Might even also be the kinds of requests and things that happen. But here you can see in our email example, notice how the features for email are described very much in business terms as much as possible. Avoid using a lot of technology and technical terms if you don't really need to. So for email, we know that we need to send and receive mail, we need to provide calendaring, we might need to provide mailbox storage up to, here we said 100 megabytes. You may even say how many characters or sentences you can store. You might be able to use attachments. You can kind of look at this from a business perspective and see in general what are the really functions and features that I get if I were asking for the email service. Now the reason for doing this is to make sure that you simplify and cut down on the number of services you're actually providing, and don't confuse the business in terms of providing them with a lot of extraneous detail. For example, iMac is very typical. Installations, moves, adds, changes for PCs in many companies. A lot of people will say, I provide an iMac service. But is it really a service, or is it a feature of another service, maybe called desktop support? So again, those are ways that you can start to converge and coalesce and bring your services together, so you end up with a much smaller list than you think you really need in terms of what you're providing to the business. Service delivery channels. Again, by identifying the channel by which a service is delivered, you can cut down on the number of services that you actually provide. Here we're using email again as an example. A channel is simply a way that this service is delivered. So in the email example, I might be delivering email, or let's put it this way, the end users can receive email over their desktop, over their laptop, maybe over a RIM device, maybe over a secure device, maybe over a Palm device. The point is it's the same service, it's just being delivered in different ways onto those different platforms. IT will typically make a mistake of putting every single one of these platforms as a different kind of email service. And again, that just makes things more complex, and it makes it much harder to manage things. So think about using channels to cut that number down. Okay, what is a process? Simply a structured set of activities that provide value to a customer or stakeholder. The difference between a process and a service is a process identifies how people will deliver the service, but it's not a service in itself. And again, you will see IT people tend to make a mistake of calling processes services sometimes. I have a change management service, an incident management service. Okay, again, those are processes that deliver other kinds of services there. Processes have inputs, outputs, activities, and again, we won't get into detail on these since the ITIL books themselves do a good job of describing that, but the key thing here is these are things that people use to deliver services, not services in themselves. Okay, functions are organizational units with specific responsibilities and capabilities. So my technical support group, my operations support group, application support, those are examples of organizational units, or what ITIL version 3 refers to as functions. Service desk is also a function. The key thing is those are units of people and capabilities, and that's the thing to remember. They are not services in themselves. However, a function may have a responsibility to deliver all or part of a service. So again, it's differentiated a little bit, but again, you will see IT people tend to call these things services when they're really organizational units. Here's an operating model that you may wish to use that really pulls a lot of these concepts we've mentioned together. Underneath the services, you see that services are being delivered by those functional organizational units. So here's my operations group, technical support, applications management, the service desk, the NOC. Again, those are the groups of people, however IT is organized, that are delivering those services. Notice that their interaction with services are they are fulfilling requests, and they're also implementing releases and changes. Across each functional unit or silo is where your processes are. So operations management, technical management, applications management, the service desk, all of those functional organizational units are using common, repeatable, and consistent processes to operate with. And that's where your incident management, problem management, change management, event management, where all those processes fit. You kind of see those listed off to the left-hand side. So again, services are being supported by functions. Each functional group is operating with consistent processes, and then projects are in place to enhance and adapt those services to changing business needs. Lastly, a few things about some key roles, especially which ITIL version 3 brings out. Number one, I have a service owner. Service owner will own one or more of those services end to end. So make sure that those services are being provided and that meets the business needs. I have process owners. A process owner will own a process end to end. And then I've got within each of those functional silos a typical manager role to run that particular organizational silo. Now that particular role you'll find in most IT organizations. But the concept of having a service owner and process owner is new to IT. And again, that starts to differentiate your organization in terms of organizing itself around the services that it delivers versus just the technologies, which the business typically doesn't care that much about. Now let's take a look at Lesson 4, Organizing for the Implementation Effort. Take a few quick looks at how you might want to organize for your implementation effort, some things to think about. While the approaches that we're going to show here tend to address the more larger efforts, if you are in a small company, you may want to look at each area and maybe combine roles and things like that into less individuals to do them. Or you may decide some roles are just simply not needed because of your size and scope. So we thought it would be easier to present the larger case organization, and it's easier to just throw some things out that you don't need. But we'll take a look at what some of these are, and again, these are just some recommendations as you move forward on your efforts. Here's a good model of just how in general you may want to organize for a fairly large ITIL implementation effort. You have a steering team there at the top to govern decisions, a program office to make sure that the various projects are working together and moving on track, some governance and measurement in terms of putting together the metrics for some of the processes you may be building and solutions and putting those reports together. You may have service support and delivery teams, or in the case of ITIL version 3, however you organize your process teams, you may want to put into place there. Underneath them, supporting them, a technical architecture team for tools, organizational change team to handle the organization aspects, stakeholder initiative teams, and extended advisory and subject expert teams. Now a few words on some of the terms that may not be quite clear here, but extended advisory and subject expert teams are really people outside the core team, if you will, of your project that have additional expertise, or they might represent a business unit or maybe another IT unit, and they may be part-time involved with your effort in terms of representing the interests of that unit on your project. Stakeholder initiative teams might represent other idle projects or maybe projects similar to some of the work you're doing that you may want to start aligning yourself with or creating some alliances with. For example, you might be working on a change management solution and discover there's maybe 7 other organizations that are doing something with change management as well. So this is a good time to coalesce everybody together and bring them in as part of your project effort. So the goal here is to get a nice holistic project team together in an effort where you're looking at everything all across the board. Implementation roles. Each person coming onto the team will have one or more specific roles that they fulfill. They might be a program manager, a process owner, subject matter expert. Maybe they're a tool architect, an organization change leader, a facilitator, a trainer, technical writer, etc. Rather than to go into these in detail here within this course, because that could take some time, if you go to the Implementing ITIL book, every one of these roles is described in a fair amount of detail along with typical activities that occur within each role. So again, these will be specific sets of activities that people will play as they work on the implementation effort itself. Take a look at our stakeholder initiatives. Again, these are areas where you may find similar efforts are going on within your business organization. So examples of these might be other business units that are doing ITIL efforts, or maybe they're doing a process improvement effort and it just happens to be similar to the processes you're trying to work with on your ITIL implementation effort. For each one that you discover, bring them on board with one of these points as shown on kind of at the bottom under where it says each one discovered, determine the strategy. They might be a full inclusion to the program, so you're joined to the hip in terms of how you work together. Maybe you decide you just want to know what they're doing and you'll share information only across the board. Or you may serve on each other's teams as representatives. Or you may decide that initiative just really doesn't matter and we should ignore it anyway. But at least bring them into your team and you kind of know where everything sits right at the start. Examples of other initiatives that may be going on out there may be standards implementation or other areas of improvement types of efforts that are going on. Again, in the initiative column, these are just some examples that you may discover. There might be a COBIT effort or maybe an ISO 20000 certification effort going on. Maybe a PRINCE2 or PMI effort or TQM or CMMI. Again, treat these as external stakeholder initiatives, meaning you're going to look at each effort and group and decide how you want it to participate with your effort and bring representatives on as needed to do this. In some cases, these may just simply be standards within your organization, and again, in that case, these will really provide more guidance to how you operate. Again, you may want a representative to act as oversight to make sure that you're providing the right requirements to fit these. Here is just one example of an implementation organization approach. This particular example uses a very large global organization. Again, if you're smaller, you may just use pieces and parts of this. But the idea here is that you're maintaining that model that we saw a few slides back. There's an organization track, a technology track, a process track, and a governance track for measurements and reporting. And so on a global basis, we have global versions of each of these, and then we have local versions of each of these. Towards the bottom, you see where your extended stakeholder teams are at. That's your advisors and subject matter experts, your core teams, and coalition teams, which I'll talk about in a minute for very large companies. But again, this is just one way you might organize to try to pull things together. And again, this is described in the Implementing ITIL book in much more detail. Let's take a look at coalition teams. These are probably needed if you're in a very large global type of organization. What you're doing here is you've got a situation where maybe you've got lots and lots of data centers around the world, and how do you get everybody on board to do a fairly straightforward approach in terms of single processes and those kinds of things. So a coalition team is really a group of representatives from each of those operating centers around the world, and you're going to add them, or add their voice, if you will, to the implementation team to communicate, number one, have them provide input, but also tell them and communicate how some of the new changes will work and how some of the new operating processes and things like that will work going forward. But to do this, you can kind of leverage this a little bit like a software distribution exercise, and that's how this is organized. In this example here, I have a single coalition leader that represents the global sets of operating centers around the world, and that leader will be directly plugged into the implementation team. That leader works with a small panel of local center coalition leaders. In this example, we used a leader maybe for the Americas, and maybe another one for Europe, and then maybe another one for Asia, just as an example here. Within each of those silos, let's say the Americas, for example, I may have a number of local center representation that needs to happen from a number of operating centers. Those in turn may have other operating centers that they manage or control as well. So again, you can kind of fashion a hierarchy stack of representation. So as, let's say, new operating processes come into play, they kind of go right down through these organizations, through the hierarchy to the smallest center from the largest. So again, this is a bit like a software distribution where you might stage something and then roll it out to its subparties, and this is really kind of working along the same line there. The other thing here is that the coalition leaders, if you will, or representatives, are responsible to make sure that their local center, operating center, is bought into the new solutions that are coming down the pipe. So they have a responsibility to make sure those things will work, and if they don't work for any reason, they have a responsibility to bring that back up the hierarchy to eventually to the implementation team to identify what that issue is so that they can either adjust their processes or figure out how they best want to deal with that. Again, this is just for very large implementations where you're looking typically on a global basis or where you have a lot of regional operating centers that you want to bring into that ITIL. At this point, we've now covered the first learning module. Starting with Module 2, we're going to cover each of these work stages in more depth. We'll start with the visioning work stage. That will be the primary focus for Module 2. Here we're going to cover how we set a vision in place, identify business issues, how we work with stakeholders, how to deal with potential resistance to your efforts, and a number of other things. So we've now completed Module 1, Getting Started. And again, in this module, we covered the overall approach for implementation, covered the key steps for implementation, identified some key implementation concepts, and a little bit around organization and how we might organize for success. So with Module 2, we will move on to the visioning stage, and again, there we will see a lot more detail in terms of how that visioning stage works and how we get started down our ITIL journey.